Very much look forward to exploring images of a modern Italy. As Luca has introduced, I still have a slide to remind us of the next appointment that will conclude our series of lectures on the 13th of May, Contemporary Italian Photography in Search of a New Realism, and a quick summary of what we explored last week. You will remember that we looked at the formation of identity, how photography can help creating a sense of individual as well as national identity. We explored that with the Contessa di Castiglione, that I hope you have explored further after my talk. And we also looked at how ultimately nobody's happy with the way they looked. Even in the 19th century, it was essential to retouch your appearance and to look perfect. We also looked at the emergence of a cohesive national identity in Italy through the photographs of Giacomo Caneva, among others. The first time Italians got a clearer sense of who they are, just looking at each other's traditional clothing and traditional local realities. We looked at Stefano Lecchi's first reportage, war reportage, in which we see the devastation that resulted from the important historical events that characterized the mid-19th century in Italy and the beginning of the process of unification. And in that context, I also talked to you about the Macchiaioli, that you will remember a precursor, a movement that came before Impressionism and that pioneered some of the ideas that will become central to Impressionism, but that also used photography to create some of the paintings we're looking at now. We looked at the rise of national identity as photography enabled the iconization of important characters like Garibaldi, and the first fake news, of course, the Italian fake news of the Breccia di Porta Pia, as you will remember, which didn't quite happen through the door, as we see in the fake image I just showed you. And of course, the beginning of color photography, as we can see here, the first memories of photography in Italy in color through photography capture towards the end of the 19th century. So we begin with George Eastman. We're not in Italy, as you will see. A lot of today is actually based on relations between Italian culture and American culture, but also with something important in connection to the popularization of photography. And when I say popularization of photography and mention the surname Eastman, many of you will be already thinking about Kodak. How many Kodak logos do you need on one building? As many as you can, clearly. We think we do branding today. Think about what was happening right here at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the last century. Kodak revolutionizes the world of photography because it invents this. This little camera is called the Brownie, and it's technically a box. I can show you this photograph of a Brownie here. You may have seen them in thrift stores. There's so many of them were produced that it's not rare to encounter a Brownie in a thrift store in the United States. You can get it for usually $20, $30. And it's technically a cardboard box with a lens, as you can see here. The focal range is fixed, so you can't focus on anything specifically. It's like one of the old cameras that you probably used during the 1960s and 70s yourself. You can't do much with the lens, but it takes neat pictures of objects and people that are relatively distant from you. Now, Eastman had a great idea. Make the Brownie affordable, because that will mean more people can use it. And put a film inside the Brownie at the moment of purchase. That means you will use your Brownie. It was advertised broadly. You can see how These adverts have the price, well displayed here, $1, it's cheap, and the use of women and children using the brownie was essential to convey the idea, a bit sexist, the idea that cameras are so easy to use, even a woman and a girl can use it. However, it worked a treat, perhaps because it was marketed so efficiently for the minds of the time. And the other catch with the brownie was that you, as the consumer, were not trusted to replace the film inside the camera. Because as you know, that's a delicate moment. That's when you can ruin all the pictures. So you would return your camera to the photographic shop and they would process your prints, return them to you at a cost, of course, and give you back your brownie with another film inside. So you as a consumer, as a photographer, you were never allowed to mess with the film. It was deemed too complicated for the consumer, but guess what? They're giving you back your brownie with a film inside. Whoa, I'm going to take more pictures. That's how Kodak became the empire that we know today. However, the brownie is responsible for perhaps an even bigger revolution. The bigger revolution the brownie instills is democratic. And look at this lady, how she holds the brownie. That frees up the point of view in photography. It creates images nobody had ever seen, especially on the streets. This is the moment at the beginning of the last century where photography suddenly appears on streets and captures everyday life more than ever before in ways that were more effective, original, and inventive, because those who take pictures are not trained to take pictures. And that could be a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing because it's refreshing. Their optics are not brainwashed by classical art, like it was the case with professional photographers. A bad thing because lots of bad photography was taken in the process. You can't escape that. Now, this is a beautiful photograph of Nadar, who is one of the most professional and most successful photographers in Paris, taken by Eastman himself. And you can see there the flexibility of the camera and what it could accomplish. But taking photographs at street level also meant that you could document anything around you that didn't seem particularly relevant. And one of the things that was documented a lot, thanks to the idea of the portability of the camera, I cannot stress enough how important it is that the brownie was this little box. You saw that lady holding it, right? It's really important. Older professional cameras were really heavy, chunky wooden boxes that required a tripod. Before you took it out with you, you had to think twice about it as a professional. It was expensive equipment. What you took pictures of was influenced by the heaviness and bulkiness of the camera. What you could take pictures of was influenced by the bulkiness of the camera. So in this case, the beginning of documentary photography, rough and ready like we know it, really begins with the invention of these portable cameras. And I am showing you an image here that some of you might find very poignant because it is Ellis Island, and nothing spells immigration like Ellis Island in the history of America. Now, photography placed an important role in the history of immigration in two ways. First of all, imagine Italians, and obviously Italians were only, as you know, a small percentage of the population that immigrated to the United States between the beginning of the last century and the 1930s. But Italians, especially in the South, looked at images, photographs that were circulating of a land of dreams. America was depicted in very surreal terms. Chicken as big as a car, onions as big as a truck. Photo montage created the image of an Italy that, of an America that could never exist, and that uneducated Southern Italians took for granted to be true. There is, of course, sadness in the stories of immigrants that leave behind their country to look for fortune and stability so far away. As you all know, the journey would take sometimes over 2 weeks. Other times it could take a month, depending on the power of the engine of the ship and the conditions at sea. And the conditions that these migrants experienced were absolutely treacherous. They had no money to pay for any kind of luxury traveling at the time. And even luxury traveling at the time was not the luxury traveling we expect. Upon arrival at Ellis Island, this is the scene. A lot of lining up, a lot of examination, some of them repatriated because they didn't fit the parameters or displayed traits that were considered undesirable to the United States at the time. And photography really enables us to reconstruct a picture of a key moment in the history of Italy that will become emblematic to the United States as well. So there is this connection between the history of Italy and the loss and what Italian immigrants find in the United States. As you know, Italian immigrants found all sorts of hardship. I don't want to linger too long on this really fascinating subject, but there are many documentaries online that you can access to see how poor they were at the beginning, how poor many of them remained, and the poor living conditions they endured, but also the marginalization. This is a beautiful image, that one of the many images that was preserved in archives of Little Italy on Mulberry Street in New York. And you can see here how vibrant the scenery is. Of course, what's missing is the smells, the dirt, the rundown environment, as well as the fear of pandemics, which also dominated the time. Immigrants especially were often used as scapegoats for pandemic. And by the 1920s, 4 million Italians had immigrated to the United States, which began to raise concern and not only led to a change in the laws of immigration, but it also escalated into riots that took hold of most part of the world when Sacco and Vanzetti were accused of damaging the business of an American entrepreneur and were condemned to death. The death sentence seemed absolutely harsh in the context of the crime that they may have not committed nonetheless, and it led to riots across the United States, then Milan, Rome, London, and nevertheless, Sacco and Vanzetti were sent to the electric chair in 1927, which was again caused a major uproar and discontent. So the history of Italian immigrants in the United States is incredibly well documented through images of immigrants waiting, immigrants doing labor, working hard, and sacrificing, as well as other images of working classes. This is the beginning of photography really developing an ethical stance towards the purpose of displaying the suffering of the working classes. This time in Mexico by an Italian photographer who was an immigrant to the United States called Tina Modotti. I'm sure many of you have heard about Tina Modotti. She traveled to the United States in 1913 and joined her father. She was from Udine in Italy, and she joined her father in San Francisco. She was quite lucky with her career and started off, her uncle in Italy owned a photographic shop. So there was an interest and knowledge of photography at such earlier time in the history of photography itself. And when her father moved to San Francisco, he opened a photographic shop and he tried to make it work. In that context, she became a model and then she became an actress. But it's when she takes on the camera later on in her life that she really develops a body of work that it's not incredibly generous. She didn't take many photographs, but it's groundbreaking in the way that she uses the camera for social justice. So in this case, you can see here this workers' parade in Mexico and the sea of sombreros becoming almost abstract, but at the same time retaining the urgency of a protest. This is a May 1st parade. So the sombreros in this case become signifiers of a social reality and a social class, but they also become a symbol of resistance. And you find Tina Modotti developing a very stylish and very complex uh, aesthetic ability to convey political ideas through her photographs. So you can see here using symbols that are politically charged, but nonetheless connected to everyday life to create very iconic images. So what's fascinating about Tina Modotti is her ability to retain everyday life in the context of her images and at the same time elevate everyday life to the iconic realm. You can see here again another example. This is like early photographic example of political still life. She's really charging up the tradition of the still life in Western painting with meanings of sustenance, resistance, as you can see here. And of course, she developed communist ideals that eventually led her to move to Moscow, which is where she will die suspiciously at the age of 45. This is one of my favorite images by Tina Modotti called The Hands of a Marionette Player. This was actually a friend of hers who came to visit. One thing I haven't told you is that when Tina Modotti becomes successful as an artist, as a model and actress, she then moves to Mexico City. And in Mexico City, she becomes friends of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. She's part of the cultural scene in Mexico City. And Diego Rivera had invited a friend who made puppet shows to stay with them for a while. And that's the context in which this image was made. But as you can see here, Tina Modotti again plays this really interesting iconographic game in which reality becomes ideologically charged. The hands of the puppeteer become the hands of the state, controlling and maneuvering people. But as you can see here, the threads appear broken and the puppeteer is no longer in charge of controlling. And therefore, the image is a sign of resistance, again, a sign of defiance towards power, but that's nonetheless expressed in a very sophisticated and very aesthetically balanced and measured way. That's the constant in Tina Modotti's photography, which makes Tina Modotti an Italian, female Italian pioneer of photography abroad, documenting the hardship of the working classes, immigrants, and political and social struggle. This is one of my favorite, perhaps even more favorite than the previous Tina Modotti image, because Tina Modotti developed a very stylistically aware conception of her photography, playing with abstraction at the time where abstraction wasn't necessarily very widespread in the photographic world. I have to say also a few things about how photography was still not considered an art form more broadly. Today it's easy. I say so, but on and off I come across people who think that photography is not quite an art form like painting. But it was a long journey for photography to purge itself from the dirt of mechanical reproduction. Right? That's the problem with photography. The fact that it's created through a machine, a mechanical means, always hindered the idea that it could be art with a capital A. The idea that it requires limited skills in comparison to painting also came in the way of it becoming an art form in itself. But this is how photography begins to really lay the foundation even further, even more than what had been done during the 19th century. By cropping reality, by charging reality with symbolic meaning, by turning images of everyday life into true political statements. Artists like Tina Modotti really contribute to that long and torturous journey for photography to become considered an art form. And in this case, the abstraction, as you can see here, the reduction of reality to very streamlined, abstracted motifs, is still part of a political discourse. This image has been interpreted as a representation of the modernization of Mexico, and therefore it hints towards a kind of commentary, a socio-political commentary of the evolution of a culture and the nation. And again, Diego Rivera really loved these images. He really felt that Tina Modotti was doing a fantastic job at conveying political ideals without making the photographs fall into the propaganda category, which was seen as less important than art photography. And trust me, we will see propaganda today, because we know we're looking roughly at photography taken between 1900 and the 1950s, 60s, and you will remember what happens throughout that period of time, very complicated period of time that continues to impact our lives today. Cubism. Now, we need to look at art to understand why photography changes the way that it does. You will remember Cubism, easy to do so, Picasso, Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, one of the most important paintings in the history of Western art. Just in a nutshell, I'm sure you're all familiar with Cubism, but it's about looking at your subject from different point of views and putting the image back together, partly because the world had changed so dramatically. Think about all that had happened during the 19th century. The industrialization of the world. Think about Darwinism, psychoanalysis, the invention of film, the invention of flight, the Wright brothers. There's so much. The world is changing so rapidly that painting is beginning to look obsolete. Photography challenges painting to reinvent itself and remain relevant. And this is what Picasso and Braque are trying to do with Cubism. Photography can look at the world from one point of view. Cubism looks at the subject from different perspectives and puts them back together, as you can see in these paintings. But the reason why we're looking at painting and Cubism is because while Cubism doesn't have much to do with photography, there's a movement that it's thoroughly Italian, in the good and in the bad, that was related to Cubism, strongly influenced by Cubism. And that movement is Futurism. Pardon me. Futurism, complicated movement that, after a long while, started to take photography seriously. What is Futurism about? Lots of good things and lots of bad things. Well, the good thing about Futurism is the style. Look at them. Stylish, stylish artists who lived in Milan, Bologna, Turin. It was northern Italian movement connected to Paris. That's where the influence of Cubism leads the Futurists to explore a language in Italy that was innovative, challenging, and experimental in a way that Italy had not known before. These are beautiful paintings by Boccioni, the leader of Impressionism, the leader of Futurism. But there's also artists like Giacomo Balla that we see here, the girl running on a balcony, that is super important to what Cubism couldn't quite do and what Futurism actually does. So I don't want to jump back to the Cubist paintings I showed you, but Cubism looked pretty static. It looked at an object or a subject from different angles and put them all together, but it looked like a fragmented scene that was difficult to understand. One thing the Futurists believed was left out was movement. And they began to incorporate movement, ideas that were given to them by cinema, into their paintings. So you can see here the movement of the girl from left to right across the canvas, fragmented into beautiful brushstrokes that suggest this out of focus streak of movement into the painting of Balla. But we also find the notion of movement into the paintings of Panaggi, where you can see here a speeding train. The Futurists loved speed because they believed in progress. And even when they looked funny like this, when you can see here the legs of this little dog and the owner, Futurism is always trying to experiment to push painting ahead of itself, to do something it had not done before. This is where things get a little murky and a little dark with Futurism. Some of you, I'm sure, will remember that Futurism worshipped the war. And it's not a surprise that paintings such as these, which, by the way, I find absolutely beautiful. This is an aerial view by Tullio Crali, and you can see this man parachuting himself down and the beautiful vision of fields right below him. The sense of distance conveyed by color is absolutely stunning. However, the Futurists liked the war a little bit too much. They really liked ideas that became very detrimental to the world with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini during the First and then the Second World War thereafter, with Hitler rising to power. During the 1930s, it becomes impossible to disentangle the history of Futurism and Italian fascism. So much that art historians don't really know what to do with Futurism that much. There are two histories of Futurism. This is the convenient way in which art historians have tried to save Futurism from being totally neglected by official art history. Cut-off line with the beginning of the First World War, roughly 1914, before Futurism becomes so overtly involved with fascism, and produce artists that worked in the Futurist movement produce works of art that basically spell Mussolini and that we might not want to see in a museum today. However, that leaves the second half of Futurism from 1914 all the way up to the 1930s uncovered or covered badly or stigmatized. And I totally understand why museums don't want to put on an exhibition that celebrates art that is overtly fascist. But I just wanted you to get the bigger picture of how Futurism ends up in trouble, because I'm about to show you imagery that entails that trouble more in detail, photographic imagery at that. So this is how Futurism develops its own distinct aesthetic language through painting, and this is how that language of photodynamism, as it is called by Anton Giulio Bragaglia and Arturo Bragaglia, two brothers, is called. Photodynamism is made of long exposures. Long exposures that, as you can see, can capture the movement of an individual. I'll leave it up to you to judge. Are these interesting images or not? Are these artistic images or not? You can see here the interesting effects of motion. Some might wonder, well, why do this with photography when you can just take a film, right? And there's something interesting about the nuances of this type of photodynamism, how it can enliven the subject and at the same time focus your attention on a fragment of time that seems to be otherwise insignificant. So this kind of photography seems to be more philosophically charged. And so much so that in the Photo Manifesto Futurista of 2011, Anton Giulio Bragaglia states, "It is a pleasure to observe that my brother Arturo and I are not photographers and could not be further from that profession," which I find a really interesting statement and a pretty strong one at that. In a world that is struggling, and when I say in a world, I mean in an Italy that is struggling to accept photography as a true art form, clearly Bragaglia is trying to state the opposite, that photography is an art form if you are not a photographer. if you don't capture what others capture on the streets with their brownies, this is what the brownie causes. On one hand, the brownie allows the documentation of everyday life, and everyone is a photographer, but it also triggers this desire from artist photographers to differentiate what they do. What they do is more philosophical. What they do is more nuanced and sophisticated. You can see here other examples. This one I find very funny. It's called La Sberla, which means the slap. And you can actually follow. I'm sure this man was really ecstatic at being slapped so hard he fell onto the ground, to the ground down here. You can follow their fall from the chair all the way down here. It must have been a substantial slap, to say the least. Again, they're interesting and yet seemingly concerned with fragments of everyday life that are somewhat meaningless. And nonetheless, Bragaglia has such pomp, the way that the Futurists were very pompous. They were very, they attributed to themselves a lot of importance. As you can see here, the kiss. Again, this is a theme that's been explored by artists throughout history, and it's represented through multiple exposure in this case. But certainly, what is interesting about the techniques explored by Bragaglia is this awareness that photography doesn't stop with the click of the shutter. And of course, the French and the Brits already knew that. There are other artists, photographers, like Ray Lander, Henry Peach Robinson, who made photomontages. They knew that the click of the shutter is not where photography begins and ends. But this type of multiple exposure, which we could trace back to Muybridge and his studies on animal locomotion, and Murray, who also used techniques that entailed capturing the motion of animals through photographic multiple exposures, are here for the first time considered art. This is what Bragaglia is saying. And this statement will remain influential for years to come in Italy, especially because in Italy, photography is struggling perhaps more than any other country to be considered an art form. And that's mainly because Italy, as we have seen, was the subject of photography, the subject of photographic attention from foreigner photographers, and struggled to insert photography in the richest history, artistic history in Europe, that's dominated by painting and sculpture as artistic forms of prominence. You see here another beautiful, perhaps one of the most artistic shots by Bragaglia. One of the things I need to say about Bragaglia is that he was part of the Futurist movement, as you can see from the manifesto he penned, but he disagreed repeatedly with Marinetti, who at the beginning, Marinetti was the leader of the Futurist movement, who at the beginning was not sold on the idea that photography should be considered art, and the two ended up going separate ways, only for Marinetti to return to art, to photography later on, and actually in the 1930s launch his own manifesto, Futurist Manifesto of Photography. But here's how the influence of Bragaglia reverberates through the work of other futurist artists who are also influenced by surrealism. This is another female Italian pioneer artist called Wanda Wultz. And Wanda Wultz was from Trieste. And she developed a really interesting, sophisticated body of work that straddles futurist ideas and surrealist aesthetics. You may not be very familiar with this self-portrait she made, and you might not be very familiar with this portrait of her cat, Pippo, but I bet you're familiar with this. This is the sandwiching of the two negatives from the previous images that Van der Waals created in order to create a hybrid between herself and her cat, People. Now, there's something really fascinating here because if I had a cat, I would probably call it People. It's just like the quintessential Italian name for a cat. There's something fascinating about this image because, of course, it's been trivialized to death. It's a classic cliche postcard image because most people seem to take it as this idea of women as feline, kind of seductive mysteriousness. But Van der Waals was actually trying to convey something different. And I think what remains fascinating is the notion that ultimately, taking an image of your own cat, of your pet, is different from taking an image of a cat. With this image, Van der Waals is trying to explore the similarity between her and her cat, the proximity between her and her cat, that intimacy between a pet and an owner once you live together, and this idea of how one becomes a little bit of the other. So I think that's a so much more interesting notion, an idea through which we can understand this pioneering portrait that plays so much in the aesthetics of surrealism, but that has its feet firmly planted in the work of Bragaglia, even if it's not about movement. The two, Van der Waals were very much influenced by Bragaglia. So you see this influence running through her work. And here again, with this beautiful classical female nude in which Van der Waals opts for hiding the face of the model and rendering the body almost incomplete deliberately in order to create a sense of mystery. Another pioneer master of Italian Futurism is Guglielmo Sansoni, also known as Tato. Now, we're getting into murky territory here that we've been hovering around the shadow of Mussolini extensively, and you start to see these icons of modernity that the futurists adored. You begin to understand that we're moving closer and closer to the moment in which the futurists and fascism and Nazism become far too embroiled. Photomontage, as well as sandwiching of negatives, as you can see here, become predominant in the art of futurism to express ideological notions related to fascism. You can see here Guglielmo Sansoni creating a ritratto dinamico, which is ritratto dinamico. It's a dynamic portrait of Marinetti, the leader of the futurist movement, who of course looks very troubled and intense and in the process of speaking and delivering messages. This is a very crucial moment in the history of Italy and also in the history of the world, in which photography is really harnessed as an ideological medium that can infiltrate the minds of the masses much more than painting. It's funny to see how photography is being still discredited as a legitimate art form, and yet we know it inside out that photography has a much more pervasive power over the minds of people than painting does, especially in today's times. Painting is not quite as able to convey content as rapidly and effectively. So Marinetti and Tato will issue their Manifesto della Fotografia, which follows Bragaglia after they come around and decide that, yeah, okay, photography can be an art form. And they say that the photograph of a landscape, of a person or of a group of persons obtained through harmony, the minutiae of details and a typicality that makes one say it looks like a painting is absolutely passé for us. So the ideology of futurism is that photography has to do so much more than reproducing reality in a romanticized mode that alludes to painting. They advocate the identity of photography as loyal and faithful to the mechanical essence and nature of photography. Again, they say, we must realize new possibilities for photography, the composition of absolutely extraterrestrial, astral, or psychic landscape through the use of thickness, elasticity, turbid depths, limpid transparencies, algebraic or geometric values having nothing human or vegetal or geological about them. The aim of all this research is to permit the science of photography to break into the realm of pure art more and more and automatically favor its development in the fields of physics, chemistry, and of course, warfare. So this is not necessarily all negative, but you can see, of course, the pomp, right? The futurists are very good at pumping themselves. But you can see here the invitation or exhortation to lift photography from the triviality of everyday life and to engage with the medium in a way that is creative in order to represent futurity and modernity. Photography becomes the medium of modernity, while painting seems more and more relegated to the discourses of the past. And again, here, Guglielmo Sansoni, also known as Tato, creating a portrait of Mussolini. This is the study for La Stirpe. And you can see here, of course, the idolization of political figures in ways that are, in a sense, unprecedented unless we consider the approaches to image making in constructivist Russian imagery. There's a massive debt from those aesthetics that travels to Italy, and ideological propaganda delivered through photography uses photomontage extensively to create imagery that conveys greatness. In this context, here comes my cinematic recommendation for this weekend. If you have never seen Ettore Scola's Una giornata particolare, which translates in a special day, you are missing out. This is a true gem. Dare I say now, probably my favorite Italian film, maybe heads to heads with Amarcord by Fellini. What happens, I won't tell you the whole story because otherwise there's no point in watching it and I don't want to ruin it, but you can already see the stars here. This is Sophia Loren and Marcello Mastroianni. How can you go wrong in an Italian film with Sophia Loren and Marcello Mastroianni? You can't. But it's fascinating. It's a very fascinating proposition. The story plays out in a building in Rome on the day in which Hitler came to Rome to meet with Mussolini. So everyone is out and the building is deserted. And the only two people who are left in the building are Sophia Loren and Marcello Mastroianni. And I'll let you discover why the two of them are the only people in the building, along with the very nosy building keeper, if you decide to watch the film, which is absolutely stunning. But there's a scene that I thought was very relevant to this talk and the context of photography in the popularization of fascism, when the character played by Sophia Loren entertains Marcello Mastroianni's character in the kitchen. She shows him this scrapbook of fascism that she keeps. And to Marcello Mastroianni's character, that's of course a sign of concern. It's, wow, what are you doing with this? But it's interesting because these scrapbooks were actually very popular among people and especially among women. It was considered to be a viable female engagement with politics to cut photographs out of periodicals, magazines, and newspapers and engage with the fascist imagery in the way that you see here, where you can see photographs of Mussolini on the right-hand side, photographs of the family, and it says at the bottom, l'uomo non è uomo se non è marito, padre, soldato. So now you know I can actually read Italian. I've not lied all along. I was born there, which translates into a man is not a man if it's not a husband, a father, and a soldier, of course. So I thought this is an interesting segment from the film in which you can appreciate the importance of photography and how photography enters the minds of women, even in the domestic sphere. There is a sense that the character played by Sophia Loren is not educated to a level that allows her to comprehend the political and historical complications of a character like Mussolini, and yet she is devoted to him mostly because of the propaganda images that she has been educated to collect to create these idiosyncratic scrapbooks of worship that were very popular in Italy at this time. Moving on returning to the artistic level of the representation of fascism with the work of Marcello Pellizzari, and again, this photo montage of Mussolini as a pilot, as you can see here, interspersing the reality of the visual imagery with technology. Mussolini and the plane become one. That is the message you gain from the image. And of course, photography begins to find its indispensable placement on periodicals, as we see here. Photography becomes the evidence, but also the matrix of the ideology of fascism. So there's something important to remember at this point about the circulation of photography and how it is used to normalize notions of racism. A lot of what I'm saying now might sound relevant to today. As you can see here, this is a magazine published in 1938 dedicated to the validation of racial discrimination. This is called La difesa della razza, which translates into the defense of race. And you can see how, again, photo montage is used very, not even like subtle, but it's strategic to separate a classical sculpture from representations of African art and eventually an individual, a Black individual of African connotation. So photography is used strategically to enthuse people, as you can see here on posters as well, photo montage to create very explicit messages of dominion and power, and also to popularize and support Italian colonialism, like you can see here in this postcard of Gennale, which became an Italian colony that was well known for the production of bananas, as evidenced by in this black and white hand-colored photograph that became popular as a souvenir postcards of colonialism. And then again, publications directed specifically to the young to set the foundation of the fascist mindset into Italy's youth. And again, you can see here how photo montage enables the communication of very clear messages. And again, you have Mussolini here in front of an audience, a crowd that we can't even check was there for him. Or again, the channeling of technology, as you see here, and slogans, even related to art institutions. So the importance of fascist language pervaded so much everyday culture and institutional culture that you find the use of these futurist strategies used even in institutions where you might suppose these techniques, these strategies, these ideological maneuvers might not find fertile ground. Bruno Munari, one of the interesting artists who uses photo montage at this time in Italy, as you can see, plays with the clash of a classical Italy that we see here in this untitled work, and technology. Once again, the 1930s, more than any previous decade, are perhaps about the coming to terms with a technology that it's so much more pervasive and life changes than anything that had been experienced before. And like I said earlier, these foundations are traceable in other artists like Maholy Nagy, who created photo montages before the futurists became interested in photo montage. in the context of what had already been accomplished by artists like Hannah Hoch in Germany, who was a female pioneer, once again, of photomontage, cut out from magazines, as you can see in this case, to create satires of politics and culture. Now, one of the things that happens that's really fascinating about the use of photomontage is that photomontage, in which imagery comes from magazines and newspapers, is not just a gathering of images. It's actually a gathering of images that preserves the specific material traces of that very time. Because magazines and newspapers are ephemeral. They are published on a specific day or on a specific week, and therefore they capture exactly the aesthetic, the temperature of culture at a specific time, much more than any other visual document. There's something about the publishing that validates their existence in that moment in time very precisely. So when you create a photomontage using magazine and newspapers, you're really mobilizing a specific connotation of critique. You're critiquing that very time. And of course, Bauhaus is really important to the pioneering of many techniques that we encounter in photography at this time. Bauhaus was the German art school in which architecture, design, and art with a classic and A combined to create the most uncomfortable chairs in the world that were nonetheless almost so sculpture-like you feared sitting on them. And of course, items, everyday items like the nesting table, the pragmatism of Bauhaus, which, by the way, are connected to Mondrian and his beautiful minimalist painting in which he synthesized the world. So these are the ideas that swirl around the notion of minimalism that aesthetically predominate into the collages and photomontages that are made for propaganda during the 1930s in Italy. You see here, again, of course, as you may imagine, Hitler didn't like Bauhaus, so it was closed down by Hitler. And as you might remember, the art that came out of Bauhaus, along with much more art made at the same time, was labeled by him degenerate art, with an exhibition that toured Europe by the same title. It was part of the repressive fascist movement and Nazi movement in Italy. And you can see here again how photomontage can clearly convey these messages in ways that other kinds of communication could not. And of course, we find experimentation of different kinds, with posters becoming also relevant at this time, because the language of Bauhaus enables artists to explore unusual point of views and juxtaposition between photographs and fonts that had never happened before. Again, like I said earlier, there's an interesting connection between Russian film posters, the way Russian film posters of the 20s and 30s use photomontage to express ideas of modernity and progress, as you can see here, by gathering landmarks that are perceived as relevant in Italy. And as I near the end of this talk, I wanted to introduce you to the work of Federico Battilani, who revolutionized the history of reportage and created some of the most important image photo essays in Italy up until this very point. The strength of Battilani was to write essays to which he would associate photographs that created narratives. In this case, you can see this image of Bruno Munari captured in a surrealist complex with lighting effects. So Battilani was simultaneously a photo reporter as well as an artist when it came to photography. Or here, documenting Palermo and everyday life, the streets. One of the most important works he made, as you can see here, it dates back to the 1950s, and it's of miners in Carbonia. Carbonia is a town in Sardinia that had been um, founded by Mussolini to produce coal, to invigorate the coal industry, and became obsolete by 1950 because of the decline of that very industry, leaving behind terrible unemployment, protests, and poverty. And an artist that we're going to explore a little longer next time we meet, when we talk about the landscape in photography, Italian landscape in photography, Mario Giacomelli emerges as a solitary artist, one who's romantic at essence and is able to find magic in everyday life. But you can see here how in this paesaggio, which is a landscape, part of a series called Presa di coscienza sulla natura, which means to become aware of nature. He uses this cloth, construction cloth, to reinvent the landscape itself. And right here, the first aerial views of Italy created in the artistic context that demonstrate the ability of humans to change the environment and to change the landscape, sometimes irreparably. And Mario Giacomelli also created a series of images, as you can see here, in which he accentuated the contrast so much that he removed the context of the scenery, and in which people just appear to be part of a narrative that is very open, provocative, and at the same time, perhaps dark in essence. The most famous series created by Giacomelli was the one that became known as Pretini, or Young Priests. The full title is Io non ho mani che mi accarezzino il volto, which means I don't have hands that can caress my face, which implies this solitude and isolation of the priests and the abstinence and lifestyle that they lead. And this is a very playful series, as you can see here, very interesting and very unusual for the time. It was exhibited at MoMA during the 1960s and made the artist famous internationally. And the last artist I wanted to look at with you to show you the range of different photographic approaches that developed in Italy during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is Kyara Samugeo. Kyara Samugeo, who is now in her late 80s, is another female pioneer of Italian photography, and you probably recognized already Alfred Hitchcock. Kyara Samugeo was born in Bari in Puglia, and she traveled to Milan to find prospects for a more exciting life, and had the opportunity to become a session photographer for a magazine called The Hours. She took on the job reluctantly, and then really understood what was at stake with photography and the possibility of photographing celebrities in ways that always came across as respectful and intimate, like we see here in the case of photographing Giulietta Masina and Federico Fellini, or here in this beautiful portrait of Sophia Loren from 1970. And also in images that subtly documented a changing Italy. You can see here, the title of the image is hinting at the fact that these are two candidates of the Miss Italian pageant competition, being observed by a lady that clearly belongs to a different generation. So you can see the humor here in her work, as well as in this image of Silvana Pampani, a very famous actress of the time, who's being photographed on a beach, and as you can see has a fur, wears a fur, which obviously looks very unusual to these children who look over in amusement and with a bit of an inquisitional gaze. So the imagery of different Italies that don't seem to understand each other also become part of the repertoire of this iconic photography.